Cowboy was forced to marry a big woman. On wedding night, she shocked everyone. The dust-choked air of Corrigan Creek tasted of desperation, bitter pride, and slow decay. Jake Corrigan stood on his porch, the ranch deed clutched in his hand. Every splintered fence post, every patch of sun-scorched earth was etched into his soul. But pride couldn't pay the debts owed to Marcus Kane, a man who circled the property like a vulture. He could still hear his father's last words, a rattling whisper from his deathbed, "Never sell son. This land is our blood." That promise was the ghost that haunted his every waking moment. Now an offer sat on the table, a deal that would save the ranch but shatter his soul. He had to marry a woman spoken of only in cruel whispers, a monster, an outcast, the giantess of Wolf Stone Gulch. Tonight he would ride to her doorstep to sell his freedom, not for gold, but for a bride he'd never seen a bad egg. He was certain would be his ruin. He was a cowboy about to be hogtied not by rope, but by a wedding ring. The dust of Corrigan Creek was a fine red powder that settled on everything, a shroud for a dying dream. It coated the sweat on Jake Corrigan's brow, clung to the dry leather of his father's saddle, and filmed the water in the trough until the horses refused to drink. The air itself tasted of desperation, a flavor he'd come to know better than whiskey. It was the taste of baked earth, of bitter pride, and the slow, inexorable decay of a legacy. He stood on the porch, the worn floorboards groaning under his weight, and stared out at the ruin. His ruin. Every splintered fence post was a monument to failure. Every patch of sun-scorched earth where lush grass once grew was a personal accusation. This land wasn't just property, it was a testament, a living thing woven from the sweat of his grandfather and the blood of his father. He could still feel the phantom weight of his father's hand on his shoulder, hear the rattling whisper from a lifetime ago. "Never sell, son. This land is our blood. Don't you ever let it go." The promise was a ghost that walked beside him, its cold fingers tracing the lines of worry on his face. Now that ghost felt more like a hangman. A letter lay on the table inside the stark black ink of the name Marcus Kane, a blot on the sun-bleached wood. Kane wasn't just a man, he was a plague. A patient vulture who'd bought up water rights, squeezed ranchers with predatory loans, and now circled Corrigan Creek, waiting for the final gasping breath. The foreclosure notice was a death sentence dated and signed. He had 1 month. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, a slow, deliberate speck against the endless blue. Not Kane's men. They always rode in packs, loud and arrogant. This rider was old, his posture slumped with the weight of years and bad news. As he drew closer, Jake recognized him. Jedediah, an old-timer who delivered mail and messages, a man whose face was a road map of the territory's sorrows. Jed dismounted, his joints popping. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Jake, Jed, got a message for you." Not from Kane. Jed's eyes, pale and watery, held a flicker of something that might have been pity. He pulled a sealed envelope from his saddlebag. The wax seal wasn't from a bank or a lawyer. It was a simple, stark T. For Thorne, Thaddeus Thorne, the recluse of Wolfstone Gulch. A man richer than God and twice as mysterious, a man who hadn't been seen in town for a decade. Jake broke the seal, his hands rough against the fine paper. The words were few, the offer immense. Jed seemed to read the confusion on his face. "He knows about your trouble with Kane." The old man said, his voice a dry rustle. "He's offering a way out." Jake laughed, a short, humorless bark. "Thorne doesn't offer anything without a price. What does he want? The last of my pride." "More than that," Jed said, and for the first time he looked away, staring at the dust devils dancing on the plain. "He wants a union, a bond between the ranches." The silence stretched thick and heavy. A cold dread, sharper than any winter wind, snaked its way up Jake's spine. He knew what was coming. He could feel the shape of the words before they were even spoken, and they were the shape of a cage. He wants you to marry his daughter." The world stopped. The buzzing of the flies, the sighing of the wind, the frantic beat of his own heart, it all went silent. Jake stared at Jed, waiting for the punchline. But the old man's face was grim, devoid of any humor. Brianna Jake finally choked out the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. The giantess of the gulch. You're telling me he wants me to marry her. The cruel nickname the town had given her hung in the air between them. A woman no one had seen in years, a girl who by all accounts was more beast than human. They say she's formidable, Jed offered, choosing his words carefully. Strong, taller than any man in the territory. Keeps to herself. They say she's a monster. Jake exploded the words, tearing from him in a wave of disbelief and fury. A cursed, witless creature he keeps locked away, and he wants to chain me to her. For what? For debt? He crumpled the letter in his fist. You tell Thorne to take his offer and his freakish daughter and go to hell. Jed didn't flinch. He simply nodded, his sad eyes saying more than words ever could. He mounted his horse, the leather creaking a final mournful complaint. It's your grave you're digging, son. I'm just delivering the shovel. He rode away, leaving Jake alone with the ugly, impossible proposition. For hours he walked the land, the foreclosure notice a burning ember in his pocket. He saw the ghosts of 1,000 happier memories, chasing his brother through tall grass that was now just brittle straw, watching his father break a wild stallion in the corral that was now just splintered wood. His father's words echoed again. Never sell. But what was worse, selling the land, the blood and bone of his family, or selling himself, his future, his very name, to a life of whispered mockery, shackled to a woman who was the stuff of campfire horror stories. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of bruise and blood. The choice wasn't a choice at all. It was a surrender. One path led to the death of his legacy, the other to the death of his soul. He walked back to the stable, his movements stiff, mechanical. He threw the saddle over his mare, his hands working from memory, his mind a hollow, echoing chamber. He wasn't riding to town to get drunk. He wasn't riding to Kane's to make a final futile stand. He was riding to Wolfstone Gulch. He was riding to meet his future, a future shaped like a cage with a woman he'd never seen as his keeper. The journey was a quiet funeral procession for the man he used to be, for the pride he was about to bury. The church was a cold, hollow box filled with the scent of dry rot and silent judgment. Every pew was packed, not for a celebration, but for a spectacle, for the final public humiliation of Jake Corrigan. He stood at the altar, his back ramrod straight, a brittle imitation of the pride he no longer possessed. He could feel their eyes on him, 100 tiny needles pricking his skin. He heard their whispers, the rustle of condemnation. Then the heavy oak doors creaked open and a hush fell over the congregation. It was not a gasp of admiration. It was the held breath of morbid curiosity. She entered, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The rumors had not lied about her size. She was tall, her shoulders broad beneath a dress of simple, unadorned gray wool that did nothing to soften her frame. She was a giantess, a creature of the wild gulch brought into this house of God. But the rumors had lied about everything else. There was no witless gaze, no brutish slump to her posture. Brianna Thorne walked with a slow, deliberate grace, her back as straight as his own. Her face, framed by a thick, dark braid of hair, was not ugly but severe, carved from the same hard granite as the mountains she called home. And her eyes, they were clear, startling gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held no fear, no shame. They held a profound and unnerving stillness as they met his. For a fleeting second, Jake forgot the mocking crowd. He saw her hands. They were large, yes, but they weren't clumsy. The knuckles were calloused, the fingers long and capable. They were the hands of a worker. They were hands like his own. The preacher, a nervous man with sweat beading on his upper lip, rushed through the ceremony, his words hollow and meaningless. When the time came, the question hung in the stale air. "Do you, Jacob Corrigan, take this woman?" Jake's throat was a knot of sawdust and shame. He saw his father's face in his mind, then the sneering smile of Marcus Kane. The word was a betrayal, a surrender, a death. "I do." He rasped the sound, swallowed by the suffocating silence. The preacher turned to her. "And do you, Brianna Thorne?" Her voice, when it came, shocked him more than her appearance. It was not a grunt or a mumble. It was low, steady, and clear as a river stone. "I do." No hesitation, no emotion. Just a simple, solid fact. The walk back down the aisle was a gauntlet of staring eyes. He felt a hand clap his shoulder and turned to see Marcus Kane, his face a mask of predatory glee. "Congratulations, Corrigan Kane," purred his voice dripping with venom. "You've landed quite a prize, a perfect match for your failing ranch." Jake's jaw clenched so hard a tooth ached, but he said nothing. He led his new wife to the waiting carriage, a black funereal box on wheels. The journey home was worse than the ceremony. The silence inside the carriage was a living thing, a dense, suffocating weight. He was trapped with her, this stranger, this giantess, his wife. He risked a glance. She was staring out the window, her profile stark against the passing desolate landscape. The harsh, unforgiving land seemed a mirror of her and of the future he now faced. What was she thinking? Was there triumph in her silence or a despair that matched his own? He couldn't read her at all. She was a locked door, and he didn't even know where to find the key. As dusk settled, they arrived at the ranch. The house's home felt alien, unwelcoming. He escorted her to the door, the threshold a line he never thought he'd cross with a bride, especially not this one. He led her up the stairs. "This is your room," he said, his voice flat, gesturing to the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. She looked at the closed door, then back at him. Her gray eyes were inscrutable. "Thank you, Mr. Corrigan." He flinched at the formality. He retreated to his own room, shutting the door behind him with a quiet finality that felt like a prison cell door slamming shut. He found the whiskey bottle waiting for him like an old friend. He poured a glass the amber liquid, a promise of oblivion. But as the liquor burned its way down his throat, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm, the one that would break him for good, hadn't even begun. The whiskey was a liar. It promised numbness, but delivered only a sharper, more intimate kind of pain. Each sip that burned down Jake's throat did not dull the edge of his humiliation. It honed it. He sat in the dark of his room, the bottle a heavy weight in his hand, listening to the silence of the house. It was a silence louder than any shouting match, a grave-like quiet that spoke of shared walls and separate worlds. Somewhere down the hall, his wife, the giantess, the stranger, existed in her own silence. He wondered with a bitter pang of curiosity if she was sleeping, or was she too staring into a darkness that had nothing to do with the night. The land outside was still. Too still. It was the first sign. A wrongness in the air. The familiar night chorus of crickets had ceased, and the old ranch dog Blue, who barked at every shadow, was silent. Jake pushed himself up from the chair, a sudden cold sobriety cutting through the liquor's haze. He moved to the window, peering out into the moon-washed yard. And then he saw it. A flicker of orange light, a malevolent firefly dancing near the old barn. It wasn't a lantern. The sound came a second later. Not a gunshot, but the hungry whoosh of a torch cutting through the air, followed by the sickening, splintering crash of wood and glass. A man's cruel laughter echoed from the darkness, and the low, panicked bellowing of the cattle began. The storm he had dreaded was here. Adrenaline washed the whiskey from his veins. He was across the room in 2 strides, his hand closing around the cool, familiar stock of his Winchester. His father's rifle, his father's land. They were coming for it all. He burst from his room, his only thought to get to the main floor to defend the heart of the house. He pounded on her door as he passed his fist, striking the wood with frantic urgency. "Stay inside," he yelled, his voice raw. "They're here. Get under the bed and don't make a sound." No answer. Only that same unnerving silence from behind the door. He didn't have time to wonder at it. He took the stairs 2 at a time, the polished wood of the banister slick beneath his palm. From the downstairs parlor window he saw the full horrifying scope of the attack. The barn was already engulfed in a hungry pyramid of flame, its light painting the yard in a lurid, hellish glow. A dozen men, maybe more. Cain's men. Their faces were demonic masks in the flickering light as they threw more torches onto the roof of the stables. This wasn't a warning. It was an erasure. "Hey, Corrigan," a voice mocked from the yard. "Come out and greet your wedding guests." Jake lifted the Winchester, the weight of it, a small, cold comfort. He sighted down the barrel, aimed for a shadow near the well, and fired. The rifle's roar was a lonely, defiant shout in the night. A man yelped in the darkness, but it was like throwing a rock at a pack of wolves. It only made them angrier. Their return fire was a volley of splintering wood and shattering glass around his head. He was alone. Utterly, hopelessly alone. He backed away from the window, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The front door shuddered under a heavy blow. Then again. Crack. The wood groaned, the iron lock straining. He was a rat in a trap, a king in a castle of crumbling sand. He was going to die here on his wedding night, choking on the smoke of his own burning history. The door splintered inward. A leering face framed by fire appeared in the gap. Jake raised his rifle, his knuckles white, his last defiant act in a life full of them. But he was one man. And they were the tide. And they were coming in. The world narrowed to the splintered frame of the door and the leering face within it. Jake's rifle was up, his finger tight on the trigger, a final futile prayer to the god of gunpowder. The man lunged, a silhouette of violence against a backdrop of fire. This was it, the end of the line. But the blow never landed. From the deep shadows of the hallway behind him, a shape exploded into the firelight. It moved with a speed that was impossible, a deceptive grace for such a large form. A blur of gray wool and righteous fury. There was the sound of splitting air, followed by a sickening wet thud that was not wood-breaking. The attacker crumpled to the floor without a sound, a fire axe suddenly embedded where his collarbone had been. Jake stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. Brianna stood over the fallen man, her knuckles white around the axe handle. The timid, silent bride from the church was gone. In her place stood a Valkyrie, her face a mask of cold, focused rage, her gray eyes blazing with a light that seemed to draw power from the burning barn outside. She was not a woman cowering from a fight. She was the fight itself, an avalanche, a force of nature unleashed in a woolen dress. She yanked the axe free with a grunt of pure physical effort and turned her burning gaze on Jake. Her voice, when it came, was not the quiet murmur from the wedding. It was a low, commanding growl that cut through the chaos like a razor. "Corrigan, the west window, keep their heads down." The command was so absolute, so tactically sound, that Jake's body reacted before his mind could catch up. He scrambled to the window, the shock giving way to a surge of pure, desperate adrenaline. He began to fire not wildly, but with renewed purpose, the shots a steady rhythm of defiance. He saw 2 more of Cain's men who had been creeping toward the house dive for cover. Behind him, he heard a sound of immense effort, a deep scraping of wood against wood. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Brianna was not hiding. She had her shoulder pressed against the heavy oak dining table, a piece of furniture that took 4 men to move, and was shoving it single-handedly across the room. It slammed against the broken front door, a makeshift barricade of solid, unyielding timber. Her strength wasn't monstrous. It was practical. It was breathtaking. They're flanking from the stables, she shouted, her eyes darting to a side window he hadn't even considered. They think we're pinned to the front. She was right. He could see the shadows moving. How had she known it wasn't luck? It was knowledge. She grabbed the second shotgun he kept mounted over the fireplace, checking the load with an expert's economy of motion. "Cover me," she ordered, and before he could protest, she was moving toward the back of the house. The fight changed. It was no longer a desperate siege. It became a hunt. With Jake pinning the main force down, Brianna became a ghost in their own home. A gunshot roared from the kitchen, followed by a scream of pain. Another from the pantry. She was using the house itself as a weapon, its familiar layout a deadly maze to the intruders. The men who had come to terrorize them were now the ones being terrorized. Their confident jeers had turned to panicked shouts. They had come for a single broken man. They found themselves caught in a meat grinder, facing a she-devil who moved with the strength of a grizzly and the cunning of a wolf. The retreat was a chaotic scramble. Men ran for their horses, their greed forgotten, replaced by a primal need to escape this house of horrors. One of them screamed something about a witch as he fled into the night. Slowly, the gunfire died down. The shouts faded into the distance. The only sound left was the hungry crackle of the burning barn. Jake lowered his rifle, his arms trembling from exhaustion and shock. The immediate danger was over. He turned his heart, pounding a strange new rhythm. Brianna stood in the center of the room, leaning on the shotgun, her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. Her face, streaked with soot, was calm again, the battle fury replaced by that unnerving stillness. The firelight danced in her eyes. He opened his mouth, 100 questions fighting for release. "Who are you? How did you? Where did you learn?" But no words came. There were no words for this. He thought he had married a simple, reclusive stranger to save his land. He was beginning to understand he had just been saved by a legend. The silence that fell after the last raider vanished was heavier than the battle itself. It was a thick, ringing quiet filled with the smell of burnt hay and spent gunpowder. Jake stood in the ruined doorway of his home, the Winchester still warm in his hands, and watched the dawn break over his ravaged land. A cold, gray light for a cold, gray world. The fire in the barn had died to a sullen orange glow, spitting the last of its embers into the morning air. The adrenaline fled his body, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness and 1,000 shattering questions. He turned. Brianna was where he'd last seen her, in the center of the room. She had placed the shotgun back over the hearth and was now methodically picking up the larger splinters of the broken door, her movements calm and economical, as if she were merely tidying up after a minor spill. The contrast between the carnage outside and her quiet composure was a chasm his mind could not cross. He finally found his voice. It was a raw, broken thing. "Who are you?" She paused, a large piece of splintered oak in her hands. She didn't look at him immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the wood as if reading its grain. Finally, she lifted her head and her clear gray eyes met his. They held no triumph, only an ancient exhaustion that seemed to dwarf his own. "I am Thaddeus Thorne's daughter," she said simply, as if that explained everything. She saw the gash on his forearm, then a long, shallow cut from a piece of flying glass that he hadn't even felt. She put down the wood and walked to the kitchen, returning with a clean rag and a small tin of salve. She gestured to a chair. "Sit." It was an order, but her voice was quiet. He obeyed without thinking, sinking onto the chair as she knelt before him. Her large, capable hands were surprisingly gentle as she cleaned the wound, her touch firm and steady. "My father knew the world was a hard place. She began, her voice a low murmur as she worked. She didn't look at his face, only at his wound. He said it had no room for fragile things. He didn't teach me needlepoint or how to pour tea. A flicker of something, a dry, bitter humor, touched her lips for a second. He taught me how to set a fence post and how to set a snare. He taught me how to read the land and how to read a man's intentions in his eyes. He put an axe in my hand when I was 10 and a shotgun in it when I was 12. She wrapped the clean rag around his forearm, her movements precise. My father did not raise a lady, Mr. Corrigan. He raised a survivor. Jake looked down at the top of her head, at the thick, dark braid resting on her shoulder. The town's whispers, the cruel jokes, the image of the lumbering, witless monster he had carried in his head, it all crumbled to dust. He saw the truth in the calluses on her hands, heard it in the quiet dignity of her voice. And a hot, bitter wave of shame washed over him, so potent it almost choked him. He had dreaded her, despised her, felt sullied by her very presence, and she had just saved his life. The sun was fully up now, its light merciless on the destruction. They worked for hours, a silent two-person crew. They put out the last of the embers, their faces streaked with soot. They calmed the terrified horses and coaxed the scattered cattle back into a makeshift pen. They didn't speak of the battle. The shared rhythmic labor of lifting fallen beams and clearing debris became its own language, a bridge built of sweat and silence. By midday, Jedediah rode in his old face, etched with a new, deeper worry. Jake, he set his eyes wide as he took in the smoldering ruins of the barn. Words come. Kane's put the word out. No one in town is to sell you so much as a single nail or a bag of flour. He's cut you off. He aims to starve you out before he comes back to finish the job. Jake's heart sank. It was the move he'd expected, a siege of a different kind. He looked at the meager supplies in his pantry. A week, maybe 2. He felt Brianna come to stand beside him. He didn't have to look at her to feel her presence, a solid, unwavering certainty at his shoulder. He was no longer just Jake Corrigan, the last of his line. He was one half of something else. "This isn't over," he said to her, his voice low. "No," she agreed. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon toward the town that had forsaken them. "It isn't." He turned and looked at her, then truly looked at her in the full light of day. He saw not a giantess, not a stranger, but his only ally, the only person on this earth he could trust. "Then we don't run," he said, a new resolve hardening his voice. "We make our stand. Here, together." She met his gaze, and for the first time he saw a flicker of a genuine, unguarded smile in her eyes. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows. Together. The fire had taken his barn, but it had forged something new in its heat. An alliance. And as he stood beside the woman who was his wife, Jake Corrigan, for the first time in a very long time, did not feel alone. He felt a sliver of something he had long thought buried. Hope. The week that followed was forged in sweat silence and the quiet rhythm of 2 people working as one. The ranch became a fortress. The air, once thick with shame and resentment, now crackled with a new and potent energy-shared purpose. They moved in a silent, intuitive dance, he with his intimate knowledge of the land's secrets, she with a survivor's instinct for its dangers. He'd show her a narrow ravine, a hidden cut in the earth perfect for an ambush. A natural funnel, he'd explain, his voice low. She would nod, her gray eyes already calculating angles and trajectories. "A perfect grave," she'd reply, "if we set the deadfall just right." And so they worked. He dug trenches where she instructed his muscles, straining his respect for her growing with every shovelful of earth. She reinforced the stable doors with iron straps he'd salvaged, her powerful hands hammering the spikes home with a force that still made him marvel. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, not in silence, but in a comfortable quiet cleaning their weapons, their hands moving in mirrored methodical motions. He would watch her, this giantess, this stranger who was his wife. He'd see the way the firelight softened the hard lines of her face, and he would feel a strange, protective ache in his chest. He had been a fool, a blind, prideful fool. She was not the cage he had dreaded. She was the walls of the fort that might just keep him alive. The warning, when it came, was not a rider on the horizon. It was a sudden, unnatural hush that fell over the land. The birds in the cottonwoods went silent. The ever-present wind seemed to hold its breath. Jake was on the porch sharpening an axe blade. He felt the change first, a tremor in the earth. He looked up, his eyes scanning the low hills to the east. A cloud was rising, not a rain cloud. A brown, angry plume of dust churned up by the hooves of many, many horses. Cain was coming. Brianna emerged from the house, a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. She didn't need to ask. She saw the dust cloud, saw the hard line of Jake's jaw, and simply nodded. It's time. They moved to their positions, a well-rehearsed two-person army. Jake took the loft of the house, his Winchester poking through a newly fortified window that gave him a view of the main approach. Brianna took the stable, a dark, defensible position with clear sight lines to the ravine they had prepared. Jake felt fear, a cold knot in his stomach. But it was different now. It was not the lonely terror of a man facing his doom. It was the sharp, terrible fear of a man with something precious to lose. Cain's army swept over the hill, a dark, spreading stain on the landscape. They rode with arrogance, a wave of brute force meant to crush and terrify. They charged toward the ranch, whooping and firing their pistols into the air. They rode straight into the mouth of the trap. Brianna waited until the lead riders entered the narrow ravine. Then she fired a single shot, not at them, but at a precariously balanced rock pillar high above. It was Jake's signal. From his perch, he fired at the key log, holding back their deadfall. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding groan, the hillside gave way. A river of stone and timber thundered down into the ravine, a brutal, crushing avalanche that swallowed the front of the charge in a cloud of dust and chaos and screaming. The arrogant charge dissolved into a panicked scramble. The battle for Corrigan Creek had begun. It was a long, bloody affair that stretched through the brutal heat of the afternoon. Cain, enraged, ordered his men to dismount and lay siege. Bullets tore through the air, chewing splinters from the walls of the house, kicking up dust around Brianna's position. Jake's rifle grew hot in his hands, each shot a carefully chosen punctuation mark in the symphony of violence. He and Brianna were a perfect machine. A signal from her, a flash of a small mirror, would draw his fire to a new threat. A low whistle from him would warn her of men trying to scale the cliffs behind the stables. But they were only two, and Cain's men were many. As the sun began to sink, casting long, bloody shadows across the yard, they grew desperate. Jake's ammunition was running low. A small group of Cain's men, smarter than the rest, had managed to find a foothold on the rocks behind the house, a weak spot he hadn't thought they could reach. He was pinned down, bullets ripping through the roof just above his head. He saw one of them break from cover, making a dash for the house itself. He had no clear shot. He was trapped. Suddenly, the stable door flew open. Brianna stood silhouetted against the dark interior, a perfect, impossible target. She raised her shotgun, and it roared a blast of fire and thunder that sent the charging man flying backward. But in that moment, she was exposed. Two of Cain's riflemen turned their fire on her. Jake's heart stopped. He screamed her name, a raw, terrified sound. He rose from his cover, forgetting his own safety, and fired his last 3 rounds in a rapid, desperate volley, driving the rifleman back into hiding. Brianna slipped back into the stable unharmed. Their eyes met across the deadly, sun-drenched yard. A silent acknowledgment passed between them. A debt given, a debt repaid. He was out of bullets. It was over. Then he heard her voice, a clear, carrying shout over the crackle of gunfire. Jake, the creek bed. Now he understood immediately. The final gambit. The one they had prayed they wouldn't have to use. He scrambled from the loft, down the back stairs, and out into the cooling twilight, crawling on his belly, toward the dry creek bed that ran behind the house. He reached the prearranged spot where a single stick of dynamite lay hidden, its long fuse snaking back toward the stable. He waited. He heard Brianna's voice again, shouting in feigned panic, making it sound as though she were retreating, falling back from the stable to the house. It was the bait. Marcus Kane, arrogant to the last, took it. Seeing his chance to finally crush them, he roared for his remaining men to charge the stable. "She's running, finish it!" Jake saw them, a dozen dark figures swarming the stable, Kane himself among them, his face a mask of triumph. Now. From her hiding place, Brianna fired her last shotgun shell. It wasn't aimed at a man. It was aimed at a small tin of oil they had placed near the fuse. The sparks caught. The fuse hissed to life, a fiery serpent racing toward its destination. Jake held his breath. The world erupted in a deafening roar and a blinding flash of light. The dynamite buried beneath the stable's main support beams detonated with the force of a judgment from God. The entire structure lifted from its foundation for a split second before collapsing inward, a vortex of splintering wood fire and screaming men. The dust settled on a scene of utter devastation. Silence. A profound, ringing silence. Slowly, Jake pushed himself to his feet. He saw Brianna emerge from her cover, her face streaked with grime, her body trembling slightly. They stood there in the ruins of their ranch, bruised, bleeding, and victorious. He walked toward her, his legs unsteady. The rage was gone. The fear was gone. All that was left was her. He reached her side, and without a word, he gently reached out and brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. His thumb lingered on her skin. "Brianna," he whispered, his voice thick with 1,000 emotions he couldn't name. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, a silent surrender far more powerful than any vow. The world had tried to curse them with a cage, a marriage of shame and convenience. But here together, standing in the ashes of their battle, they had found something else entirely. They had found their freedom.